Sign the papers or she doesn't make it through the night, the doctor said, his voice calm in a way that made it feel even colder, and I remember turning my head slowly, expecting to see my son step forward the way he used to when he was a boy and I needed help carrying groceries or fixing something around the house. But Daniel just stood there with his hands in his pockets, staring somewhere past me like I wasn't even in the room, and then he said it, quiet and flat, "I'm not signing anything." And for a moment I thought I had misheard him because the fluorescent lights were too bright and the machines around me kept beeping in slow, steady rhythms, and maybe my ears weren't working right. But the nurse stopped moving and the doctor's expression changed just enough for me to understand that no, I had heard him perfectly, and still I didn't say anything. I didn't cry or beg or ask him why. I just watched him the way you watch a stranger who somehow knows your name, trying to recognize something familiar in a face that suddenly feels like it belongs to someone else entirely, and behind him, just a step to the side, stood Rebecca, her hand resting lightly on his arm, not gripping, not forcing, just there, like a quiet reminder. And she didn't speak, not a single word, but I could see it in the way her fingers pressed ever so slightly into his sleeve, the way his shoulders stayed stiff instead of turning toward me, and I realized in that moment that whatever decision had just been made, it hadn't started in this room, it had been planted long before I ever arrived here, maybe days, maybe weeks, and all I had done was arrive at the end of it, the final step where my life was suddenly a discussion instead of a certainty. And the doctor tried again, explaining things in measured terms about timing and risk and how a signature was all that stood between action and waiting. But Daniel shook his head once, barely noticeable, and said, "I think it's better not to rush into anything," like he was talking about a business deal instead of his mother lying in a hospital bed. And Rebecca finally spoke then, her voice soft, almost concerned, "We just want to be sure we're making the right decision." And I closed my eyes for a second because that sentence didn't belong in a room like this, not when time was something you could measure in heartbeats and breaths, not when the right decision was supposed to be simple, instinctive, automatic, the way it had always been for me when it came to him. Because I never once hesitated when Daniel needed me, not when he broke his arm at 8 years old and I drove him 30 miles through the night to the nearest hospital, not when he called me at 2 in the morning during college because he thought he was failing and needed someone to tell him he wasn't, not when he stood in my kitchen years later and promised me, "I'll always take care of you, Mom." And I remember believing him, not because I needed the promise, but because it felt like the natural order of things, the way love moves forward through time, from parent to child and back again. But now I was lying here, listening to silence stretch between us, and I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before, something that had been building quietly in the spaces between our conversations, in the holidays that felt shorter, in the visits that felt more like obligations than choices. And I opened my eyes again and looked at him, really looked this time, at the way he avoided my gaze, at the way Rebecca's presence seemed to anchor him in place. And I didn't ask him to change his mind, I didn't ask him to explain himself, because in that moment I realized that whatever answer he gave me wouldn't be the truth anyway, not the whole truth, and if I was going to survive this, I needed to understand what was actually happening, not just what they were willing to say out loud. So I took a slow breath, ignoring the tightness in my chest, and said, as evenly as I could, "Then call my lawyer." And for the first time since the doctor had spoken, Daniel looked at me, really looked, like he hadn't expected me to say anything at all, like he thought I would just lie here and let the decision be made without me. And Rebecca's hand tightened just slightly on his arm, enough for me to notice. Enough for me to know that whatever came next, this wasn't the end of their plan, it was just the moment they thought they had already won. The room felt different after that, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with the machines or the people who slowly returned to their routines, as if the moment had already passed for everyone except me. And I could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system above, steady and indifferent, while the nurse adjusted something near my arm and avoided looking directly at me, like she had seen this kind of silence before and knew better than to interrupt it. And I kept my eyes on the ceiling for a while because it was easier than watching my own son stand 3 feet away and act like he was waiting for a bus instead of deciding whether his mother would receive treatment. And after a minute I turned my head slightly and saw Rebecca leaning closer to him, her lips moving just enough to form words I could not hear, but I did not need to hear them to understand the effect because Daniel nodded once, slow and deliberate, like he was agreeing to something he had already decided, and that was. When the realization settled in, not all at once but in small pieces that fit together too neatly to ignore, the way Rebecca had insisted on handling my paperwork when I first arrived, the way she had asked questions about insurance instead of asking how I was feeling, the way Daniel had grown quieter over the past year whenever she was in the room, like he was waiting for permission to speak. And I remembered a Sunday afternoon not long ago when I had invited them over for dinner and Daniel had started telling me about a promotion at work, something he had been excited about, but Rebecca had interrupted him halfway through with a comment about how stressful his job had become and how maybe he should consider stepping back, and he had stopped talking immediately, just smiled and said she was probably right, and at the time I had brushed it off as compromise, as marriage, as the normal adjustments people make, but lying there now, I could see it for what it really was, a pattern, a quiet shifting of control that I had ignored. Because it was easier to believe everything was fine, and I wondered how many other moments I had missed, how many times he had chosen silence over truth because it was simpler, and the doctor cleared his throat again, trying to move things forward, explaining that without consent they would have to wait, that there were protocols, procedures, timelines, all the words that sounded reasonable until you realized they were just ways of saying nothing would happen, and Daniel spoke again, this time with a little more confidence, as if the repetition made it easier. We need more time to think, and Rebecca added, it is just a precaution, her tone calm, almost reassuring, as if she was doing me a favor by delaying something that could not afford to be delayed, and I let the words settle without reacting because reacting would have meant giving them something they could manage, something they could interpret as fear or confusion, and instead I focused on breathing slowly, counting each inhale and exhale the way I used to when Daniel was a child and could not sleep, the way I would sit beside his bed and tell him everything would be okay even when I was not sure it would be. And I realized then that this moment was not about the hospital or the paperwork or even the decision itself, it was about something much larger that had been unfolding quietly for a long time, something that had reached its conclusion here, in this room, where my life had become a variable in someone else's calculation, and I felt a strange clarity replace the confusion that had filled me earlier, not anger, not yet, but something colder, more precise, the understanding that whatever came next, I could not rely on the version of my son I had known before, because that version was not standing in front of me now, and the man who was standing there was making choices I needed to understand, not question, not fight, but understand, because understanding was the only way I would find my way out of this. And I turned my head again, meeting his eyes just long enough for him to notice, and I said nothing, not a single word, because silence, I realized, was the only language he might still hear. I heard the door open sometime later, a softer sound than before, and I knew without looking that it was not Daniel or Rebecca because the air in the room shifted in a different way, less controlled, less rehearsed, and when I turned my head I saw a young nurse I had not met before, her name tag reading Emily Carter, and she paused for a moment as if deciding whether she should speak, then stepped closer to my bed and lowered her voice, Mrs. Collins, can I ask you something? And I nodded because there was a steadiness in her eyes that felt unfamiliar in a room filled with hesitation, and she glanced over her shoulder toward the hallway before continuing, did you want your son to make all of your decisions for you? And the question caught me off guard, not because I did not understand it, but because no one had asked me anything like that since I had arrived, and I realized then how quietly my voice had been removed from the conversation, how easily everyone had accepted that I would simply lie here while others spoke on my behalf, and I answered slowly, choosing each word carefully, no, I did not, and she nodded once, like she had expected that answer, and then she hesitated again before saying, I overheard something earlier, and I think you deserve to know. And I felt my chest tighten, not with fear but with recognition, because this was the moment when the pieces I had been collecting would finally fit together, and she continued, your daughter-in-law spoke with someone from billing this morning, before you were brought up here. She was asking about coverage, about what would happen if certain procedures were not approved in time, and she paused, watching my face, but I did not react. I did not give her the response she might have expected, because the words were not surprising. They were confirming something I had already begun to understand, and she added quietly, she also asked about your existing directives, whether there was anything already filed that would limit immediate intervention, and that was when something inside me settled into place, not panic, not anger, but clarity, because this was no longer about hesitation or fear or even misguided caution. This was about control, deliberate and calculated, and I thought back to the past year, to the way Rebecca had gradually inserted herself into every detail of my life, offering help that I had not asked for, organizing paperwork that I had managed perfectly well on my own for decades, suggesting that it might be easier if she kept copies of everything, just in case, and I had agreed because it seemed reasonable, because it seemed kind, because I had not yet learned the cost of that kind of convenience, and now I could see the full picture, the careful positioning, the quiet accumulation of information, the slow narrowing of my independence until this moment, where a single signature had become a barrier instead of a formality. And I looked at Emily again and said, "Thank you for telling me," and she nodded, relief flickering across her face, as if she had been carrying something that did not belong to her, and before she stepped away she added, "If you need someone to contact on your behalf, you can tell me, you do not have to wait," and I watched her leave, the door closing softly behind her, and for a few seconds the room was still again, but it was not the same stillness as before, it was sharper, more defined. And I turned my gaze toward the doorway where Daniel and Rebecca had stood earlier, imagining them just outside, speaking in low voices, planning the next step in something they believed was already under control, and I realized they were counting on my silence, on my willingness to let things unfold without resistance, and for a long time I had been that person, the one who kept the peace, who trusted without question, who believed that love was enough to hold everything together. But as I lay there listening to the steady rhythm of the machines, I understood that love without awareness could be turned against you, and awareness, once it arrived, changed everything, and I reached slowly for the call button at my side, my hand steady despite everything that had happened, and when the nurse answered I said, clear and deliberate, "Please contact my attorney, his name is Richard Hale, his number should be in my phone, I would like him here as soon as possible," and as I released the button I felt something shift, not in the room, but within myself, because for the first time since I had arrived, I was no longer waiting for someone else to decide what would happen next. I lay there with my eyes half closed, listening to the steady rhythm of the machines, but my mind had already drifted far from the hospital room, pulled backward into memories that suddenly felt sharper than the present, and I could see Daniel at 8 years old sitting at our kitchen table with his homework spread out in front of him, frustrated because he could not understand a math problem, and I remember pulling up a chair beside him, explaining it step by step until his face lit up with that small, proud smile he always had when something finally made sense, and he looked at me then like I had all the answers in the world, like there was nothing I could not fix for him. And I stayed up late that night helping him finish every assignment because I did not want him to feel alone in something that scared him, and the memory shifted to a different year, a different version of him, standing in the driveway with a duffel bag over his shoulder, leaving for college, and he hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe and said, "I will make you proud, Mom," and I believed him without hesitation because everything he had ever done up to that point had come from a place of sincerity, and I had given him everything I could, every spare dollar, every extra hour of work, every piece of energy I had left at the end of long days, and I never once kept track of what it cost me because that was not how love worked, not for me, and I remembered the years that followed, the late night phone calls when he needed advice, the weekends when he would come home just to sit at the kitchen counter and talk about his life, and I was always there, always listening, always ready to support him no matter what direction he chose. And then Rebecca entered his life, and at first I welcomed her. I remember thinking how confident she seemed, how organized, how she brought a kind of structure to Daniel's world that I had never quite managed to give him, and I told myself that this was what growth looked like, that he was building a life of his own, one that did not revolve around me anymore, and I accepted that because that is what a mother does, she steps back so her child can step forward. But now, lying in this bed, I could trace the moments where things had begun to shift in ways I had not fully acknowledged, the conversations that ended too quickly, the visits that felt more like obligations than choices, the way Daniel would glance at Rebecca before answering even simple questions, as if her approval had become a necessary step in every decision. And I realized that I had mistaken silence for peace, That I had allowed distance to grow because I did not want to confront what it might mean, and the memory that stayed with me the longest was a small one, almost insignificant at the time. A Sunday afternoon when I had invited them over and Daniel had started to tell me something important. Something about a new opportunity at work, but Rebecca had gently redirected the conversation, saying it could wait, that there were more pressing things to discuss, and he had stopped mid-sentence without protest, just nodded and let it go. And I remember feeling a brief flicker of unease then, something I could not quite name, but I dismissed it because it seemed easier to believe that everything was fine, that this was just the natural evolution of a family, and now I understood that those moments had not been isolated, they had been part of a pattern, a quiet reshaping of his world that had slowly moved me to the edges of it, and as the memories settled, I felt something inside me shift again, not sadness, not regret, but a kind of steady resolve, because I had not raised my son to be cruel, and yet here we were, in a room where he had chosen hesitation over action, distance over instinct, and I knew that whatever had led him to this point, it had not happened overnight, and if I wanted to understand what came next, I had to see everything clearly, not just who he had been, but who he had become, and as I opened my eyes again, the hospital ceiling came back into focus, and with it the quiet certainty that the past could no longer guide me through what was happening now. I heard their voices again before I saw them, low and measured just outside the door, the kind of conversation people have when they think they are being careful, and I did not move, I did not call out, I simply listened, because there was more truth in the spaces between their words than in anything they had said directly to me, and Daniel spoke first, his tone uncertain, I just think we should wait a little longer, and Rebecca responded almost immediately, her voice calm but firm, waiting is the responsible choice, you do not want to rush into something that could complicate everything later, and there was a pause, the kind that used to mean he was thinking for himself, but now it felt different, like he was searching for the right answer instead of forming one, and then he asked something that made my chest tighten, what about the paperwork we discussed, and I could hear the faint rustle of fabric as she shifted closer to him, lowering her voice just enough that I had to focus to catch each word, that is already being handled. The attorney said we just need to make sure nothing changes before everything is finalized, and I felt the meaning settle slowly, deliberately, because this was not about uncertainty or fear. This was about timing, about making sure certain conditions remained exactly as they were, and Daniel exhaled softly, like someone trying to convince himself that he was doing the right thing, and said, I just do not want to make a mistake, and Rebecca answered with a quiet certainty that did not leave room for doubt, you are not. You are protecting what is yours, and something about that sentence stayed with me, not because of the words themselves, but because of how easily he accepted them, how quickly they became his reasoning instead of hers, and I realized then that whatever hesitation he had shown earlier was not about me, it was about aligning himself with a plan he did not fully understand but was willing to follow, and the door opened a moment later, and they stepped back into the room, their expressions composed, their movements controlled, as if the conversation outside had been nothing more than a brief discussion about schedules or errands, and Daniel avoided my eyes again, moving toward the window, while Rebecca stepped closer to the bed, her smile soft, almost reassuring. How are you feeling? She asked, and I looked at her for a long second before answering, because it was a simple question that carried no real interest, just another part of the performance, and I said quietly, I am still here. And she nodded, as if that was enough, as if my presence in this moment was simply a detail to be acknowledged and not something that required action, and she glanced at the chart at the foot of the bed, flipping a page with practiced ease, and I noticed how comfortable she seemed in that role, how natural it was for her to handle things that did not belong to her, and Daniel finally spoke again, his voice carefully neutral, the doctor said we can take some time, and I turned my head slightly to look at him, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a clarity that made the distance between us impossible to ignore, and I said nothing, because I understood now that this was not a moment that could be changed by words. This was something that had been built slowly, deliberately, and it would not unravel because I asked the right question or made the right appeal, and instead I watched them, the way they moved around each other, the way decisions seemed to pass silently between them without needing to be spoken, and I realized that I had been removed from that exchange long before I ever entered this room, and as the silence settled again, I felt a quiet certainty take hold, not about what they would do, but about what I would do next, because for the first time since I had arrived, I could see the situation clearly, not as a moment of confusion or miscommunication, but as something intentional, something structured, and understanding that changed everything. The shift happened quietly, without any announcement or visible change in the room, but I felt at the moment I stopped waiting for them to decide and started deciding for myself, and it began with something simple, something small that neither Daniel nor Rebecca seemed to notice, because they were too focused on maintaining the version of control they believed they had, and I pressed the call button again, not urgently, not desperately, but with the calm certainty of someone who understands exactly what they are doing. And when the nurse returned, I did not look at my son or his wife, I looked only at her and said, "Please confirm that my attorney has been contacted," and she nodded, glancing briefly toward Daniel as if expecting a reaction, but he said nothing, and that silence told me everything I needed to know, because there had been a time when he would have stepped forward, asked questions, taken charge of the situation, but now he remained where he was, letting things unfold as long as they aligned with the plan he had already accepted, and Rebecca shifted slightly beside him, her posture still composed but her attention sharper now, as if she was beginning to sense that something was moving outside of her control, and she asked, "Why would you need an attorney right now?" Her tone light, almost curious, but I could hear the edge beneath it, and I turned my head just enough to meet her eyes and said, "Because I would like everything to be handled correctly," and I let the word correctly settle between us, knowing she would hear the meaning behind it even if she chose not to acknowledge it, and Daniel finally spoke, his voice cautious, "Mom, there is no need to complicate things," and I watched him carefully, noting the way he framed it, not as concern for me, but as a desire to keep the situation simple, predictable, manageable, and I answered in the same calm tone I had used all along. "It is already complicated," and for a moment neither of them responded, and the nurse quietly adjusted the settings on the monitor before stepping back again, leaving the three of us in a silence that felt different from before, because this time it was not empty, it was charged with the understanding that something had shifted, and Rebecca's composure faltered just slightly, not enough for anyone unfamiliar with her to notice, but I had spent years observing people, understanding the subtle ways they revealed themselves, and I saw the calculation in her eyes, the quick reassessment of what this new variable might mean, and she said, "We are only trying to make sure everything is in your best interest," and I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it was predictable, the kind of statement that sounds reasonable until you examine it closely, and I replied, "Then you should have no problem with me making my own decisions," and Daniel shifted his weight, uncomfortable now, caught between the version of himself he had been and the one he had become, and he said, "We just want to avoid unnecessary risks," and I looked at him for a long second, seeing the conflict he was trying to suppress, and I said quietly, "You are not avoiding risk, Daniel, you are choosing it," and he did not answer, because there was no easy response to that, no way to reconcile the logic he had been given with the truth he was beginning to sense, and Rebecca stepped closer again, her voice softer now, more deliberate, "We are a family, we should be making these decisions together," and I let that sentence hang in the air before answering, because it deserved to be heard clearly. A family does not remove someone from their own decisions, and for the first time since this began, neither of them had anything to say, and as I settled back against the pillow, I realized that the balance had already begun to change, not because I had raised my voice or forced a confrontation, but because I had stopped accepting the role they had quietly assigned to me, and in that moment, I knew that whatever came next would no longer happen without me. Richard Hale arrived just before the room could settle back into the illusion they were trying to maintain, and I heard his voice in the hallway first, calm and direct in a way that did not ask for permission to be heard. And when the door opened, he stepped in with the quiet confidence of someone who understood exactly where he stood, his suit neat, his expression composed, and he looked at me first before acknowledging anyone else. "Margaret," he said, as if this were a routine meeting instead of something far more urgent, and I nodded slightly, the smallest confirmation, and then he turned to Daniel and Rebecca with a polite but unmistakable distance. "I understand there are some decisions being discussed," and Daniel shifted again, caught off guard by the sudden presence of someone outside the narrow circle he and Rebecca had created, and he said, "We were just taking time to consider the options," but Richard did not respond to that immediately, he simply stepped closer to the bed. placing a thin folder on the side table, and said to me, "I brought the documents you requested," and there was something in that sentence that changed the atmosphere of the room, something that made it clear this was no longer a conversation they could control. And Rebecca's posture straightened almost imperceptibly, her composure tightening as she recognized a variable she had not accounted for, and she spoke with that same measured tone she had used all along. "I am not sure this is necessary. We are only trying to make sure everything is handled properly." And Richard turned to her then, his expression polite but unyielding. Proper handling begins with the individual's rights being fully respected, and he let that settle before continuing. "Mrs. Collins has full authority over her own medical decisions, and any delay or obstruction would need to be clearly justified." And Daniel opened his mouth as if to respond, but hesitated, and I could see the uncertainty in his eyes now, the first real fracture in the certainty he had been holding on to, and I realized that he had never expected to be questioned, not like this, not by someone who spoke with clarity instead of emotion. And Rebecca stepped closer again, her voice softer, more persuasive. "We are her family. We are trying to protect her from unnecessary risk." And Richard nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without accepting it. "Then you will have no objection to her expressing her own wishes." And he looked back at me, not prompting, not pressuring, simply giving me the space that had been taken from me earlier, and I understood exactly what he was doing. He was not speaking for me, he was making sure I could speak for myself, and I turned my head slowly, meeting Daniel's eyes again, and this time he did not look away immediately, but there was something different there now, something unsettled, something that had begun to question the path he had been following. And I said, clearly and without hesitation, "I want the procedure," and the words did not need to be repeated or explained. They were simple, direct, and final, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was filled with the weight of that decision, because it shifted everything at once, the balance of control, the direction of the moment, the narrative they had been constructing. And Daniel looked at Rebecca instinctively, as if waiting for her to respond, but she did not speak right away, and in that pause, that brief moment where she did not immediately guide him, I saw the truth more clearly than ever, that he had been following, not leading, that his hesitation had never been his own. And Richard spoke again, his tone steady. "Then we will proceed accordingly." And the nurse, who had been standing quietly near the door, moved forward with a renewed sense of purpose, as if the room had finally been given permission to function as it should have from the beginning. And Rebecca's expression shifted again, not dramatically, but enough for me to see the calculation behind it, the quick adjustment to a plan that was no longer holding together the way she had intended. And Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly, and I realized that for the first time since this began, he was no longer certain of the choice he had made. And as I settled back against the pillow, I understood that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something far more revealing, because once control is challenged, it does not return quietly, it either breaks or it fights to hold on, and I had no doubt which one Rebecca would choose. The nurse moved with quiet efficiency after that, preparing what needed to be prepared, checking monitors, adjusting settings, and speaking in low, professional tones that restored a sense of order to the room. But the real change was not in the movement around me, it was in the silence between Daniel and Rebecca, because it was no longer controlled, no longer coordinated, it had become uncertain, and I could feel it without needing to look directly at them. The way people shift when something they believed was certain begins to unravel, and after a few minutes Rebecca stepped closer again, her composure carefully rebuilt but not quite as effortless as before, and she said, "Margaret, maybe we should take a moment to reconsider. There is still time to think this through." And I turned my head slowly, meeting her gaze with a calm that I knew unsettled her more than any raised voice could have, and I said, "I have already thought it through." And she held my gaze for a second longer than necessary, searching for something, a hesitation, a doubt, anything she could use to reassert control, but she found nothing. And Daniel spoke then, his voice quieter, less certain than before. "Mom, we just want to make sure everything is clear." And I could hear the shift in him, the way his words no longer carried the same confidence, and I realized that for the first time he was not speaking from a place of borrowed certainty, he was trying to find his own footing again. And I answered him gently, not as a challenge but as a statement of fact. "Then you should listen to what I am saying." And he looked at me, really looked this time, and I saw something there that had been missing before, not clarity, not yet, but the beginning of it, the first crack in a structure that had been built around him, and Rebecca stepped in again, quicker this time, her voice softer but more urgent. "Daniel, we talked about this, we agreed it would be better to wait." And the word "we" lingered in the air, heavy with implication, and I saw him hesitate, caught between the agreement he had made and the reality unfolding in front of him. And I realized then that this was not just about control, it was about timing. About holding a situation in place long enough for something else to be secured, something that depended on delay, on inaction, and I spoke before she could guide him further, my voice steady. "You were not waiting for clarity, you were waiting for something else," and she turned to me sharply, her composure tightening. "That is not true," she said, but there was no conviction behind it, only resistance, and I continued, not raising my voice, not changing my tone. "You asked about coverage before you asked about my condition, you asked about directives before you asked what I wanted, and you are still asking for time when time is the only thing I do not have to give." And the room went still again, but this time it was different, because the words had been spoken plainly, without accusation, without emotion, just the truth laid out in a way that could not be easily dismissed. And Daniel looked at Rebecca, confusion and something else flickering across his face, something that looked a lot like doubt, and she opened her mouth to respond, but stopped, just for a second, and in that second everything shifted, because silence, I had learned, reveals more than words when someone no longer knows which version of the truth to present. And Richard spoke then, his voice calm and final. "We will proceed as instructed," and the nurse nodded, stepping forward again with purpose, and I watched them both, Daniel and Rebecca, standing side by side but no longer aligned, no longer moving as one, and I understood that whatever had been carefully constructed between them was beginning to separate, not because I had forced it, but because it could not withstand the simple presence of truth. And as I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the steady rhythm of the room settle around me, I knew that this was not the end of the conflict, it was the moment where it could no longer remain hidden, and once something is seen clearly, it cannot return to what it was before. The room settled into motion again, quiet and purposeful, as if the decision had finally been acknowledged by everyone except the two people who had tried to delay it, and I could feel the difference in the air, the way the tension shifted from uncertainty to something sharper, something that could no longer hide behind polite words or careful silence. And Daniel stood there still, his hands no longer in his pockets but hanging loosely at his sides, like he was unsure what to do with them now that the moment had moved past him. And I watched him for a second, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a kind of clarity that left no space for illusion, and I said his name quietly, "Daniel," and he looked at me immediately this time, no hesitation, no avoidance, and I held his gaze just long enough to make sure he understood that this was not the same conversation we had been having before, and I said, "You did not refuse to sign because you were unsure," and I let that settle before continuing. "You refused because you were told to wait," and his expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough. The kind of shift that comes when someone hears their own actions described in a way they can no longer disguise, and Rebecca stepped forward quickly, her voice controlled but tighter than before. "That is not what happened," but I did not look at her. I kept my eyes on my son, because this was not her moment, this was his, and I said, calmly, "Then explain it to me," and the silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before, because it required him to choose, not between me and her, but between truth and the version of it he had been repeating. And he opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again, and in that pause I saw everything I needed to see, not certainty, not conviction, just the absence of both, and I nodded once, as if he had answered me anyway, and I continued, "You thought you were protecting something," and this time I glanced briefly toward Rebecca, just long enough for her to understand that I saw her clearly, "but you were protecting a plan that did not include me," and Daniel's shoulders shifted, a subtle movement, but one that carried weight. Because it was the first sign that he was stepping out of alignment with her, even if he did not yet realize it, and Rebecca's voice sharpened slightly, "This is not the time for accusations," and I turned back to her then, meeting her gaze fully for the first time, and said, "No, it is the time for truth," and she held my eyes, her composure still intact but no longer effortless, and I could see the calculation behind it, the rapid adjustment to a situation that had slipped beyond her control, and I added, not louder, not harsher, just clearer, "If I had not spoken, you would have continued to wait, and if you had continued to wait, Everything would have remained exactly as you needed it to be, and I let the implication rest there without elaboration, because it did not need to be explained, not to her, not to him, and Daniel finally spoke again, his voice quieter, more uncertain than I had ever heard it. Mom, I did not think it was like that, and I looked at him for a long second before answering, and there was no anger in my voice, only a steady truth. You did not think about it at all, and that was the moment something shifted completely, not in the room. Not in the process that was already moving forward, but in him, because he looked away then, not out of avoidance, but out of realization, and Rebecca said nothing, because there was nothing left for her to guide, nothing left for her to reshape, and as the nurse returned with the final preparations, the quiet efficiency of her movements filling the space that had once been occupied by hesitation, I let my eyes rest on Daniel one last time and said, softly but without doubt, you did not refuse to save me. You just showed me who you are willing to become, and I closed my eyes after that, not because I was finished, but because for the first time since this began, I no longer needed to watch the outcome unfold to understand it.